G'day folks, welcome back to Classroom Hatchery Television. Today we're going to be learning about another modern day challenge to the restoration of Atlantic salmon in Lake Ontario, climate change, from Adam Weir, who is a fisheries biologist here at the OFAH. Johnny is going to be back to teach us about the world's fastest fish and another fishy fact. We also have our hatchery checks, some hatchery maintenance, and we're going to release the alevin from their condo in tank number 1. Let's get started with our hatcheries. As always, we'll start by checking to make sure that all of the hatchery equipment is functioning properly. Starting with hatchery number 1, the filter is running, the air pump is running, and our temperature is 3 degrees Celsius. The eyed eggs in this tank have now hatched, except for 2 of them that have turned white and died. We now have 98 alevin in tank number 1. As some of them have only recently hatched and the temperature is lower than we had in tank number 2, there are a lot of still intact egg membranes inside the condo. Watch for them when I release the alevin. And hatchery number 2, the filter and the air pump are running, and the temperature is 6.5 degrees Celsius. Our alevin in this tank are looking healthy. They're using up their yolk sacs and will soon become fry on the hunt for food, at which point I will begin to feed them. When they start to swim around, there'll be a new danger for them that we'll rectify today. On the filter intake, which is the part of the filter where the water is sucked up, there's a piece that is designed to keep fish from being sucked up into the filter. While this will work for a larger fish, our little fry will be small enough to fit between those slots. I'm going to simply put this small piece of nylon window screening over the intake and then hold it on with this elastic. And this will allow the water to pass through into the filter, but keep the fish out. And I'll do this to both of our tanks. So what I do first is I, again, shut off the power. And then this tube just pops right off like that. Wrap that around like so, and put the elastic on. Water in, fish out. Okay, let's release our alevin from tank 1. So our process will be the same as we did with the other tank. I'm going to shut off the power, rearrange the rocks, undo the nuts and bolts, and then open the 2 halves of the condo, like the wings of a butterfly, and the alevin are going to move down into the rocks. Here we go. This week we are going to be talking about a big and important topic, climate change. Our climate is very complex. It's regulated by many factors, including changes to the Earth's orbit and rotation, variations in solar activity, volcanic activity, and biological processes. Plants, animals, fungus, and microorganisms influence climate and climate change. Humans are influencing the climate by releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and through deforestation, as trees and other plants are crucial for removing those greenhouse gases from the atmosphere.
There are many actions that you can take to reduce your individual greenhouse gas emissions. But there are also actions that we can take on a community level to reduce our emissions. For example, communities can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by providing access to alternative transportation options, like biking and walking, or by transitioning to electric transportation. Communities can also reduce their emissions by investing in compost pickup programs or backyard composting. And while all of these actions help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there are many nature-based climate solutions that help capture and store greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, Alice Peterborough is a program in partnership with the OFAH that works to do just that. ALICE, which stands for Alternative Land Use Services, is a Canada-wide program that works with farmers to restore environmentally sensitive, marginal land into flourishing ecosystems. And in turn, these restored lands help reduce the impact of climate change by capturing and storing carbon. In the Peterborough region, ALICE works to restore and create native prairie and pollinator habitat, forests and forested areas, wetlands, and many other natural areas. Native prairie and pollinator habitats can help reduce the impacts of climate change because they store carbon in the ground in their massive root systems. For instance, when you compare native grass roots to common lawn species, you'll see that the roots of native species are much deeper and larger, which allows them to store much more carbon. You probably know that forests store a huge amount of carbon, but did you know that wetlands do as well? This means that the protection, restoration, and creation of forested areas and wetlands can help take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the earth. In addition to reducing the impacts of climate change, ALICE projects have a multitude of other ecosystem benefits, like creating clean water, increased biodiversity, and habitat for wildlife. Also, Alice Peterborough creates opportunities for local stewardship activities such as tree planting. So if you're looking for a way to get involved and reduce climate change in your community, you can reach out to your local ALICE organization and see how you can help. So while we must continue our efforts to reduce our individual and community greenhouse gas emissions, it's also important for us to look out into our local landscape and see how it can help. And in turn, we will help restore the land.
In the face of climate change, we need to be adaptable to the changing conditions, and we need to examine our role in causing these changes. Like with most problems that humans face, solutions lie in understanding the complexities of the problem. To do this, we must listen to one another in respectful dialogue, being open to one another's ideas, opinions, expertise, and perspectives, so that we can work together towards better outcomes. I'll turn it over to Adam now, and he is going to talk a bit about climate change and how climate change is and can impact fish.
Hi there, my name is Adam Weir. I'm the fisheries biologist for the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. I'm here to present the Classroom Hatchery program, and we're going to talk about climate change and the impacts on fish. So just as a general overview, I'll provide an introduction and background to myself and the organization. We'll be explaining what climate change is and greenhouse gases and human activities, scientific consensus around climate change and the impacts on fish, case studies, as well as how we can all do our part in slowing the effects of climate change. So again, background for myself. My name's Adam Weir, work for the OFAH. It's Ontario's largest nonprofit fish and wildlife conservation-based organization, and we represent 100,000 members, subscribers, and supporters, 725 member clubs. Typically, I work on government proposals and advocate on behalf of Ontario's angling community, as well as I participating on various advisory councils, working groups, committees, typically dealing with fisheries management, planning, regulation development, issues, concerns, and all sorts of things. So some of my past experiences is that I've been a longtime angler. Ever since I was a little kid, I think I've had a rod in my hand, and I was introduced into hunting, particularly bow hunting in my early 20s. I went to school for engineering, but quickly decided that I didn't want to be an engineer, and I pursued a career in fish and wildlife. I've done a variety of outdoor and environmental job experiences, say, for example, with conservation authorities, including Quinte Conservation, Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority, and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. I worked as an animal care committee intern and a field camp technologist at Fleming College. I was a project manager for renewable energy projects across Northern Ontario, as well as doing natural heritage assessments and other environmental impact assessments with that job. I worked on Baffin Island, Nunavut in the Arctic, primarily doing geotechnical surveys as well as bird surveys. And I also worked for a remote fishing and hunting lodge in northwestern Ontario, where I worked and lived for a while. Okay, so let's talk about climate change. So we're going to kickstart the conversation and describe what climate change actually is. We'll talk about greenhouse gases and the greenhouse gas effect, human activities that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as a scientific consensus around climate change. What is climate change? So climate change can be described as a long-term shift in weather conditions related to things like temperature, precipitation, wind, snow cover, and other indicators. It can be caused by a couple different things. So this could be natural processes and human activities. Natural processes would include solar radiation from the sun, for example, or volcanic dust that's trapped in the atmosphere. Whereas with human activities, it comes from burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil, and through the emissions of greenhouse gases and other substances. So the real cause for concern here is the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What are greenhouse gases? So these are gases in the atmosphere that absorb heat radiated from the Earth. So it's just like the way the glass of a greenhouse warms and traps the air inside. This is why we use the term greenhouse. So concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased significantly since pre-industrial times, particularly from 1950 till now. And this has been contributed by the burning of fossil fuels as well as deforestation. So this increase has exacerbated the greenhouse effect and the warming of the planet, and has impacted things like weather patterns, precipitation, and storm events. So this is a quote that I like. It's from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they state that continued emission of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystem. So it's definitely a cause for concern, not only for humans, but for our ecosystems as well. So here's a little depiction of what's going on with the greenhouse gas effect. Let me just play this here. Sun reaches the Earth. Some energy is reflected back into space. Some is absorbed and re-radiated as heat, and most of the heat is absorbed by greenhouse gases and then radiated all directions, which warms the Earth. So this comes from NASA, actually, this nice little graphical depiction of what is going on. So, what human activities contribute the most to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? We already talked about this a little bit. So again, the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Fossil fuels are used for everyday things like transportation, manufacturing, heating, cooling, electricity, generation, and other applications. So these things that we always need day to day in our lives really contributes to the burning of fossil fuels. And it's also human land use activities as well. This could be ranching and agriculture and the clearing and deforestation of our forests and natural environments. Here's another quote from the IPCC. So the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. This is a nice graphical depiction we have here. So it shows historical information related to carbon dioxide levels that we've had in the Earth's atmosphere. This comes from ice core samples, and it has this comparison to the 1950 level and where we are currently. And you can see that for millennia, we have not gone over this level, and you can see that significant increase from the Industrial Revolution until now. So now we're basically building an argument here and providing some scientific consensus around climate change and the associated impacts, greenhouse gases, and the warming of the planet. And so these quotes that I provided from the IPCC, again, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this comes from a synthesis report on climate change and is based on reports of 3 working groups that are part of the IPCC. So this is an organization of governments that are members of the United Nations or the World Meteorological Organization. They have 195 members, and thousands of people from all over the world contribute to the work of the IPCC. So NASA, they note that multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that greater than 97% of actively publishing climate scientists agree. And back to quotes because I love them. Climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activities. In addition, most of the leading scientific organizations worldwide have issued public statements endorsing this position. And I think we can really jump back to that graphical depiction that showed historically what was going on through the ice core samples that were taken and 1950 and part of the Industrial Revolution, what went on with human activities then, and then greater than half a century later, where we are in our current situation. So, climate change and fish. So what is expected to happen? So we know that there's going to be an increase in air and water temperature. There'll be a decrease in ice and snow cover, and there'll also be changes in the timing and amount of precipitation that's going on. So how will this impact fish and fisheries? I like this quote from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. It comes from a report they did on brook trout in Ontario, but really this applies to pretty much all fish, is that temperature is critical to survival and for regulating physiological processes in fish. So an increase in water temperature will affect the distribution of fish, the growth, the reproductive patterns, and the survival of fish as well. Climate change will lead to more nutrients, hydrological modifications, habitat degradation and loss, pollution, and also the spread and distribution of invasive species will also increase. What I'd like to do now is jump into some more specific examples of climate change and the impacts on fish. So we'll do a few case studies. We'll jump into a couple cold water species, which include lake trout and brook trout. And then we'll talk about some cool water species, that would be the walleye and the yellow perch. And we'll finish off the conversation on the spotted gar. So let's talk about the lake trout. It is a sensitive cold water fish species, requires deep, well-oxygenated cold water habitats. So it's long-lived, it's slow-growing, and matures at a late age, has low reproductive potential, and low recruitment and replacement rates. So with climate change, we expect to see an anticipated loss of thermal habitat volume and quality. So we'll see this area within the water column that it really needs, and it'll just shrink it, essentially. Also, with climate change, we expect that this will improve habitat conditions for invasive species and competitors that will outcompete the lake trout as well. Moving on to another cold water species, the brook trout. So with climate change, we'll see declining water levels and decreased flow, which will reduce critical spawning and rearing habitat for the brook trout. This will increase habitat loss and will fragment habitat as well and potentially restrict access to spawning grounds. So with an increased water temperature, we'll see a decrease in the availability of cold water habitat for them to carry out their life processes. And again, just like the lake trout and being a sensitive species too, with climate change, we'll likely see a greater distribution of invasive species and them infiltrating these areas where brook trout are and competing with them and outcompeting this species. Moving on to cool water species. So let's talk about the walleye. Gonad development is primarily driven by temperature and photoperiod. The gonads are the reproductive parts to the fish. So Walleye require extended winters of 3 to 5 months with mean temperatures below 10 degrees Celsius for adequate gonad development. So short winters, which are characterized by being less than 3 months, or warm winters, which have mean temperatures that are above 15 degrees Celsius, can lead to poor ovary development, decrease in egg size, and decrease in reproductive success, as well as an increase in egg mortality. So we can really see how climate change and the warming of the planet could potentially negatively impact the species. However, there's also studies that indicate that the warming of the planet may increase available habitat for the species, and models suggest that they could actually increase their range and distribution within the province. Moving on to another cool water fish species, the yellow perch, which is closely related to the walleye. Under certain climate change scenarios, we can actually see them benefit. So with increased precipitation, we will likely see an increase in river discharge. And larval yellow perch really rely on this discharge because it creates these large, turbid, cloudy plumes where they seek and find refuge to avoid predation and still allowing them to feed. However, just like the walleye, with shorter winters that we would expect to see with climate change, they will likely negatively impact ovary development and the reproductive success of the yellow perch. Lastly, I would like to talk about the spotted gar. So this is a pretty unique species we have in Canada, and it's one of the rarest freshwater species we have in the country as well. It's listed as endangered under Ontario's Endangered Species Act and the Federal Species at Risk Act. So the habitats that it likes is backwater, quiet bays that are warm and dense with vegetation and shallow. They're tolerant of these warm waters and low dissolved oxygen and can survive in these conditions for a long time. One interesting point to mention about the spotted gar is that they can actually gulp air, bring that air into their swim bladder, and absorb oxygen that way, not just using their gills. The range of the spotted gar is really limited in Ontario due to cool water temperatures. So under climate change and the warming conditions we would expect is that this may actually allow them to expand their distribution and the range, as well as improving their migration and dispersal opportunities in the province. However, and conversely, climate change scenarios have also demonstrated that common reed distribution will expand and the range will expand, and this reduces the amount of preferred available habitat for the spotted gar. Also, other studies conducted by Fisheries and Oceans Canada indicated that the spotted gar is highly vulnerable to climate change and the impacts this has on coastal wetlands. Let's do a recap here on climate change and fish. So some impacts are predictable. We talked about sensitive cold water species like lake trout and brook trout. And under most, if not all, climate change scenarios is that these species will likely not do well with warming conditions and other weather events brought on by climate change. Whereas tolerant and warm water species, there may be predictable impacts. It could actually benefit these species. They could be climate change winners. So other outcomes are less predictable, like with cool water species. The percids we talked about, walleye and yellow perch, is that, we have these benefits that are potentially going to occur, but they're often contrasted by negative impacts as well. So basically, in a nutshell, there are lots of uncertainties and unknowns, and it's really hard to predict the impacts of climate change and what they'll have on species. But I think we can broadly say is that the pace of climate change is unprecedented, and already stressed aquatic ecosystems will be faced with even greater challenges into the future. So I'd like to end the presentation today with actions that we can all do to help slow the impacts of climate change. So be energy efficient by greening your home. Choose green power. Plant trees, riparian plantings and maintaining native vegetation and trees along the shore. Choose sustainable transportation. Conserve water. Incorporate green infrastructure into your landscape. Eat locally. Reduce your waste. Rethink, refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, and recycle. The 6 R's, not just the 3 R's, and get involved and informed. And some of the best ways you can do this is getting a fishing and hunting license. So all of the license sales in the province of Ontario go straight into the special purpose account, and this money is used for the management and conservation of our fish and wildlife resources. It's used for monitoring and assessing our fish and wildlife as well, and it goes right back into these resources to benefit them and anglers and hunters. So also join a conservation organization. A lot of these actions you can really do through an organization and be a part of something that is bigger than just yourself. And just as a recap of what we talked about today is that we did a breakdown of climate change, the causes, the impacts, human involvement, as well as the scientific consensus around climate change. We talked about climate change and the impacts to fish. We did several case studies on indigenous species we have in Ontario, as well as ways we can all slow the effects of climate change. I'd like to take the time to thank everybody for participating in this presentation. It is a complicated subject with no clear answer, lots of uncertainties and unknowns, but hopefully I provided a little bit of information that was understandable related to climate change and the impacts on fish. And stay safe, stay healthy, take care.
Hello everyone. Thanks for checking out this week's segment of Fishy Facts. I'm Johnny Nene. This week, we're going to talk about an incredibly fast fish, the sailfish. Sailfish are an epipelagic billfish found throughout the temperate and warm parts of the world's oceans. Epipelagic refers to the part of the ocean where sunlight penetrates, allowing for photosynthesis to occur, and is typically about 200 meters deep. Sailfish can reach up to 3 meters in length and weigh upwards of 220 pounds. Their upper jaw extends into an elongated bill, which they use to stun their prey. Sailfish also have a large dorsal fin that resembles a ship's sail, which is where their name comes from. Sailfish feed on squid, octopus, and fishes such as anchovies, mackerel, sardines, jacks, and needlefish, among others. Sailfish will hunt in groups to increase their success. They use their large dorsal fin to herd schools of small fish while alternating attacks from either side of the school. This makes it difficult for the prey to predict where an attack will come from. It also helps that sailfish are widely considered the fastest fish in the ocean. They can reach speeds up to 110 kilometers per hour, making escape even tougher for their prey. Sailfish will often venture closer to shore than other billfishes, making them accessible to recreational anglers. Sailfish flesh is quite tough, and they are not typically sought after for their meat, but they are considered a prized game fish for recreational anglers, and they are often targeted around the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. When hooked, sailfish put up a tremendous fight, and they will often make acrobatic leaps out of the water to try to shake the hook. A fight could last multiple hours. Well, that's all I have for you guys for this week's segment of Fishy Facts. I hope you enjoyed learning about the sailfish, and be sure to check out next week's segment. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Classroom Hatchery Television. Thanks again to Elizabeth and Johnny, and a shout out of thanks to Adam for presenting today. Next week, we're going to be learning about the protection of water from some of our local conservation authorities. Until then, keep on swimming upstream.